what I was trying to do. Yeah, it has to, I don't know why, usually it comes out of here, but for some reason it's not coming out of here. If you can, please.
Looks like you've already started the recording.
Yeah, I did, simply because I wanted the folks online to know that we were here waiting for them. But yeah, we've got, everything is fine with us right now, but the only problem is that the volume is not what it usually is. Usually it projects out of the projector, and it's projecting right now out of the computer. So we've got the HDMI thing figured out, but for some reason, yeah, it's not working. Okay, let me try one more thing. Can you say something now?
No. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeti.
That when they, okay, so I just turned it back on. Okay, so
You can select which set of speakers you've got, but if you've got an HDMI cable going to a projector with speakers, that HDMI cable may be overriding everything else.
and that doesn't work. Okay, so say something now. Say something now, Dave.
Check 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
Yeah, unless there's a volume switch on here that we don't know about.
You never normally tinker with that.
Yeah, it just automatically comes
Yeah,
out.
usually just.
Yeah, so I've got them on the speakers from here, from the computer.
Okay, yeah, that you can do that.
But the volume just
I'll go
isn't very
get-
loud.
I'll go get Richards. He's got a mic.
Okay.
Oh, he's
Can
got
we
a.
just use the, yeah, I did. Okay. The lavalier? Where is the speaker on this thing? Oh, okay. And then, Dave, one more time, can you do a test for me?
Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, yeah, now I can't hear you at all. I mean, I was hearing you better before. Can you do it again?
Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, that's all right. We've got a speaker coming to hopefully amplify what's coming out of the laptop, because right now in this cavernous room, unless you are going to project greatly, then we're not going to be able to hear it. So,
Well, I could go into my Southern Baptist preacher routine if you want.
yes, please. That's probably what's going to have to work. So, Southern Baptist preacher it is. Hey, Gloria, how are you?
Is this straight? Oh, no, just crooked.
So the problem is usually the microphone comes out of the vent, but it's not really.
Have you guys turned the volume up?
Okay, say.
Microphone. Not microphone. Well, we can turn that too.
Okay, so Dave, are you still there?
I'll turn my camera screen off momentarily, by the way.
Yeah, see, I don't know if you heard that, but that was. Okay.
Somebody find with the.
Yeah.
All right, try it now.
Dave, can you do another test for us?
Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah. And I think you probably did that on purpose. You made your screen green?
Yes, I did.
Okay. All right. So. Is the mute on?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Well, the reason I belong, the actual reason.
Okay, so right now we don't have him on the Intel, because if we do, we can't hear it either. Do I need to put him on that and test again? On this thing?
Yeah, put him on listen to.
Okay. So I'm going to switch you over and then I'm going to ask you to do another test, Dave.
Sure.
Okay, can you do another test for us?
Check. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, yeah, nothing. Okay, and another test?
Check. 1, 2, 3.
So,
All right, then it's coming out of your laptop.
yes.
All right, would you turn Bluetooth on this laptop? I started to bring my other speaker today. I don't know why. Now I know why.
Bluetooth, I don't know. I never used Bluetooth there.
There it is.
It's on.
Add Bluetooth device, is it on?
Yeah, I just turned it on. So,
Okay, choose.
These, and you know what they are, because
Yeah, talking about Okay, so while we're having a bit of technical difficulties, I want to at least welcome you all here today to presentation being done by our sponsor, CyberDefense. They'll be teaching on the newest and latest in cybersecurity things we need to know for our contracts, how to prepare ourselves for that. You plan on attending?
I lost all the background noise. I don't know if your microphone went off or not. Pamela, are you there?
Hey, Dave, can you hear us?
I can hear you now.
Okay, so we're going to put you on speaker. Yes, I do. I know, the audio is not coming through this audio here. Oh, gotcha. Yep.
Brenda, I can hear you. I have a lot of warbling noise in the background.
And again. Okay. That's the speaker.
I need to go grab something. It'll be about 30 seconds and I'll be back.
Oh, you want the mic to go through here? The speaker to come here? No. If we use audio, then this will be cut off. Yeah. Hey, Dave, can you do a mic test?
Check 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah. Dave, can you do a mic test?
Check 1, 2, 3, 4.
I think we're good.
Okay, well, so we're going to have Mr. Dave Gray and Mr. Terry is on as well. Maybe that, but Dave Gray is one of our CyberDefenses. One of our partners. Basically, your company is in result with cybersecurity issues. Make sure your company has cybersecurity issues. Today, he's going to be talking to us about the new regulations that are in place. I'll let him introduce himself and explain stuff. Also, I think you know the presentation. If you register ahead of time for the class, you do have them this presentation and also my PDF file. And you can have that in your email. You register for the class.
All right, Dave, go ahead and do a mic test, and then if it works well on our end, we'll let you know, and you can go ahead and take over.
All right, check. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I think you're good. There's a smaller echo, but I think it's working. So go ahead and start, and then we'll adjust on our end through our PA system here.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's about 6 minutes till 11 Eastern time. Just a little bit different on Central Time where I'm at. My name's Dave Gray. I work with CyberDefenses, an organization that specializes in information security, consulting, training, and other types of products. Today, we're going to do kind of a follow-up for a webinar that we did a couple months ago, where we talked about how the contracting community for the Department of Defense and for the federal government has changed pretty significantly with requirements for what's referred to as NIST 800-171. Now today we're going to review maybe a couple of slides on what we did last time just to make sure everybody's kind of synchronized. But then what we're going to specialize in or focus on today is how you would actually do the assessment, because that's where I guess the rubber meets the road. Now myself, again, I'm Dave Gray. I've got a couple of years of experience going back actually a couple of decades. Got a lot of letters on the end of my name, different types of certifications, et cetera. And what that basically means is I can pass tests. Not easily, but I can. My background involves both the private industry, the federal government, and the Department of Defense. And so I try to bring a unique perspective to the training that I do. Primarily, my focus is the perspective of the business owner. What I tell people on a regular basis is that information security is not meant to stop business. It's meant to enable business securely. Now, again, if you do need follow-up work or questions or consulting or additional training, or want to take something like this particular webinar or the one that we did before and schedule a custom session for a group of folks, we can probably do that. We also have an online training course that is a 2-day, 2 7-hour days training course that I conduct. And we usually schedule those once a month. We don't have anything scheduled for July or August right now, but if you do have a group of a half a dozen or so folks that want to take that, then by all means go to the CyberDefenses website and look at the additional details on that. So, as I said, our outcomes today, we want to do a quick review. Then we want to really focus on how to conduct the self-assessment per the latest guidance that has come from a number of different resources. We have guidance that has come from NIST, guidance that's come from organizations such as MEP that is in association with NIST, and guidance that comes from Department of Defense itself. So, as an extremely quick recap, CUI is information that law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires to have safeguarding and dissemination controls. Now, focus in on just 2 words of that top bullet. safeguarding and disseminating. Safeguarding is basically the protection so that you ensure the confidentiality of the data. Disseminating is how, once the data is in your hands, how you spread or utilize that information in your office environment, and also in turn with organizations that you may have to contract with. That could include subcontractors of vendors themselves. If you handle CUI, then you have to achieve compliance, or you could potentially lose your federal and your DoD contracts. Now, that's not as scary as it sounds. And the reason is because the Department of Defense decided to kind of overrule the Webster's Dictionary on what the definition of compliance is. And we're going to talk about that in more detail, kind of a spoiler alert. As long as you're working towards compliance, then they will consider you compliant. But you do have to jump through a few bells and whistles and hoops to make sure that you meet the documentation requirements to show and to demonstrate that you're working towards compliance. So essentially, CUI is throughout our environment, is entirely spread out through our information environment. If you have a Department of Defense or a federal acquisition regulation related contract, and in that contract there is information that has been evaluated or assigned or designated as CUI, then that information needs the type of safeguarding and dissemination controls that we'll be talking about for the next hour or so. In addition, you want to make sure that whatever you're doing in relationship to the compliance and protection is that you have brought your contracting officer in as a full partner on that. Now, that can be your organization's contracting officer, because you in turn are in fact contracting out to other subs. It could mean the prime vendor's contracting officer that you're dealing with as part of your contract. Or if you are in fact the prime vendor, then it means the federal agency's contracting officer. Now, keep in mind that the government, the United States government, has only recently begun standardization training for their own contracting officers. So fully expect that if you have multiple contracts through multiple agencies and therefore have multiple contracting officers that you deal with, do not expect standardization as of yet. That will probably come within a year or so. But until then, you may get asked to do one thing by one officer and something different entirely by another. So kind of a recap of where CUI can be found in your organization. Now, this is just kind of a very generic diagram. It shows a logical area network referred to as a LAN that's in that red cloud-like object. Inside the red cloud-like object are other cloud-like objects with different sectors of the type of information that typical organizations will work with. Everything from databases to email to financials to HR or accounting. Notice that one of those has CUI in that environment. Now, around that, you've got what's referred to as a firewall, a demilitarized zone, or a DMZ. It gives you kind of a buffer zone with your organization in a typical environment. Many small companies may not have this complex one. Many large environments will have one that is infinitely much more complex. But notice all the different places that you exchange information with your information environment. Everything on the right-hand side to include laptops and smartphones and using a virtual private network to communicate to some of those devices. Everything on the left-hand side with those miniature clouds where we start talking about your partners. Your partners may include Amazon Web Services or Google or Microsoft or email at Microsoft Office 365. That chimney looking thing in red, a little bit on the left-hand side in the center, that is a firewall. That is what controls the access and the flow of information everywhere throughout your environment. So if your environment is what we refer to as commingled, meaning that CUI is everywhere in your environment, then that means that the CUI controls apply to your entire environment. If you have the opportunity to segregate the CUI into just one specific location, then the cost of implementing these controls will be much, much lower. So you essentially have two approaches. You can allow the CUI to be commingled, or you can segregate and isolate into a security zone where that CUI, that controlled unclassified information, resides. Now, there's been a lot of updates to the 800-171. It's still at revision 1, but I want to point out that every few months they're doing essentially an update for typos that they don't change the revision number. What they do is they put in very small print on page 2, right after the cover page, a phrase that simply says updates included as of, and then there's a date. So the last time that this was updated was June 7th, just last month. So if you're looking at an 800-171, whether it's revision 1 or not, it must say includes updates as of June 7, 2018. In a few months, we'll expect another one. Sometime next year, we'll actually see a revision 2. But they have already demonstrated, the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and NARA, National Archives Records Agencies, that they will sometimes do pretty significant updates and they won't change the revision number. We'll talk about one of those examples that came out with the June 7th release, where they added an entire appendix in order to help clarify how people implement these controls. That appendix, it's not just a couple of typos, it's a 43-page appendix. Now, the way that the NIST 171 is structured is we have 14 families or groupings of controls. Those groups focus on information security areas such as access or awareness and training or conducting security assessments. In parentheses on this slide, next to each of the control families, I have the number of controls in that particular family. Those controls total to be 110. And as you notice, the first set of controls in the first family, access control, there's 22 of them. So it has really over 10% of all the controls of all the different families. That doesn't necessarily mean that access control is any more important than any of the rest. It just means that alphabetically it comes first and it has the most controls. Now here's where DoD decided to contact, the Webster Dictionary organization and tell them what the new definition of compliance is, at least as it relates to this. Compliance means that you have 3 deliverables that you are working towards. The first is a system security plan. That's got a lot more detail than you can find in the 171, so we'll talk more about what is included in that. The second is a security assessment report, which of course, before you conduct or have a security assessment report, you have to have conducted a security assessment. So there's a lot of things in this set of requirements that kind of dovetail together, but until you've examined each and every one of them and then kind of looked at them holistically, you may go down a trail of working on something and then find at a later control that you kind of have to back up and turn around and redo something. The most important thing for your organization as it relates to compliance is that last bullet, the plan of action and milestones. The plan of action and milestones is essentially your record of your assessment of all the different controls, all 110, or at least as far as you've gotten, and what you plan to go do about it. There is an extremely important thing I want to mention right this second. The POAM, being a plan of actions and milestones to achieve 100% full compliance, does not have a due date other than the fact that you're working on it. So as an example, if you find that out of 110 controls, there are some significant investments or at least some efforts and resources that you won't have on many of them. Compliance means writing down what your self-assessment of the issue was, and then generally speaking, what you plan to do about it. It would be good if you also have a date of when you plan to go do something about it. But honestly, right this second, we do not have guidance from the Department of Defense that says when the POAM items are to be completed. So as an example, if you need to spend some amount of funds that you don't have programmed into your organization within the next few months, the next year, and needs to wait until the next fiscal or calendar year, whatever you work with best, then you just put that down. Now, remember what I said about the contracting officer. In your work with the POAM, that person is the one who's going to either agree or disagree that your POAM is satisfactory. So if you're working with multiple vendors and multiple contracting officers, it's quite possible that you may have a difference in the level of detail that each individual person is asking for. Now, the resources that are available for NIST 171 have expanded pretty significantly in the last few months. In some cases, we've had some draft publications of various additional documents. As of June, though, many of those documents are now finalized, and we've got new versions of other resources that we'll be talking about as we go through this morning's webinar. The first resource, of course, is the 800-171. Now, when you do look at the June 7, 2018 version, it has an additional appendix at the very end. I believe it's Appendix F. The name of that appendix is pretty generic. It says the word discussion. So for every single one of the 110 controls that you read about, I believe in Section 3, there will be a paragraph or two of discussion in this new appendix at the end of the book that essentially gives you some context of what they mean when they're referring to a specific control. Next, an extremely valuable resource is the A version of the 171. Now, there's other books that we'll talk about, such as down the list there, 800-53. There's actually an A version of the 800-53 also. But for the time being, it looks like we'll no longer need to deal with that particular book. What the A version does is that for each of the individual 110 controls, it provides you a bullet list of the types of things that an assessor should be looking for. And then along with that bullet list, it refers to the standard ways that a federal assessor or auditor would review that particular area of controls. The first is to examine the documentation that you've got. Another is to do interviews with folks that are relevant. And finally, in some cases, there may be actual tests that can be conducted to ensure that the controls are accurately in place. Now, even with the new appendix for discussion and with the 171A version, this is great. My computer just told me it's going to restart pretty soon, so hopefully it doesn't interrupt me. What the next book is the 162, the NIST Handbook 162. What the NIST Handbook 162 does is it also takes each of the 110 controls and attempts to put those controls into typical layman's terms, and then provide a series of questions that if you answer the questions, just pretend that those questions are being asked by an auditor. As you answer those questions, you'll begin to realize whether, from the federal government perspective, are you compliant with the control or not. So for each of the 110 controls, there's a range of anywhere from say 3 all the way up to 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 questions that you can answer, and you'll answer them with simply a yes or a no, or maybe the word partially, or maybe in your world, because you don't deal with something for that particular type of control, the answer might be not applicable. Finally, at the bottom, we see a piece of software referred to as CSET, CyberSecurity Evaluation Tool. Now that tool really does not do much towards explaining what the controls mean, but it does provide a consistent interface where once you download and install that tool from the Department of Homeland Security, then using that tool, you can document what you're doing. And it doesn't really work for the POAM, but it does work for documenting your status on every single one of the controls. The CSET is somewhat generic in that it's designed to work towards multiple security frameworks. So when you download and use that tool, you've got to ensure that you are using the capability where you identify the specific requirements. And in this case, the requirements will be under the 800-171. When you tell it you want to start an assessment, and you tell it that you want to use the specific requirements, there's about 30 or 40 different options it'll give you. So just select the 800-171. Measuring compliance. How, in fact, are we going to measure it? Well, first off, nobody at this point in time from the Department of Defense or from the federal government is going to come out and audit your organization. They do not have a program like that in place. They do not anticipate a program like that coming about anytime soon. For the prime vendors, the large folks like Northrop Grumman and Raytheon, Texas Instruments, they can anticipate that they may be audited by turning over or being requested to turn over documentation related to their military contracts or their federal contracts. By turning over the CSET compilation, they'll have accomplished the vast majority of that. Turning over something in a spreadsheet form or in a Word document is perfectly acceptable. There is no requirement to use any one particular mechanism or method to track how you have conducted your self-assessment. So it's your choice. Now, as you work with your contracting officer, they may express some preferences, and so this will be up to how those discussions turn out. Be sure to assess yourself honestly. There is no benefit to misrepresent how well you have information security controls in. There is a great deal of problems that could be created, though, if you were to falsify such an assessment. So very simply, create your SSP, your SAR, your POAM, and put it into a format that your contracting officer agrees will be a good format. Now, your IT organizations aren't necessarily going to be reading all of these detailed documents. They may have security folks on staff, of course, and those will be the ones working towards ensuring that everything from an information security perspective is being addressed correctly. On the IT manager's part, though, most IT organizations set up policies and standards such that they can ensure that whatever the enterprise guidance is, that they're able to maintain and hold themselves accountable for what those requirements are. Those requirements, again, would be to take policy statements. Think of the NIST 800-171 as being a collection of 110 policy statements. And then for each policy statement, you have certain metrics that will demonstrate whether or not you're maintaining and you are, in fact, adhering to that particular policy. So in the IT world, those metrics will be demonstrated in standards. So as you create standards for your organization, just ensure that they are SMART. And by SMART, we're talking about the acronym specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Obviously specific, because we know that looking directly at the 171, there may not be sufficient specificity to actually measure anything. So we might in fact refer to either or both the 171A and also Handbook 162. Now, up until a little while ago, when those additional resources became available, the option was to go look at a mapping appendix towards the end of 800-171 in Appendix D. And here you saw individual controls, all 110, being mapped and cross-referenced over to the larger NIST document 800-53. Now, 800-53 is specifically for federal organizations, and they took subsets of that 800-53 and determined which controls would be applicable to private industry. Those are the controls, the 110, that end up in that 800-171. So the bigger document from NIST, the -53, 500 pages. The A version of the 53, another 500 pages. A total of at least 900 to 1,000 pages will provide context and also provide you a way to go to sleep quickly at night, because if you've got insomnia, they cure it really quick. As you read through any of these documents, prioritize the ones that you need to use as resources. So firstly, prioritize the 171, then the 171A, and then I have this out of order, so I need to change that. Put the 800-53 down towards the bottom. So the next priority would be Handbook 162. And then consider how you're going to document everything that you're doing. And if you keep everything in a collection of spreadsheets and Word documents and PowerPoint files, that's fine, no problem. If you have a vendor or a prime or a contracting officer at a federal or military department that says, I want you to use a specific tool, then work with their specific tool. Typically, you'll see tools such as the CSAT, the Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool, being recommended. What that does for the contracting officer, of course, is it allows the information that they're getting from multiple vendors and subcontractors, the ability to kind of standardize how things are looked at. So I'll take a pause here and see if anybody has any questions so far. I don't see anybody raising hands in the classroom, and I don't see any chat messages coming up. All right, so what we're going to do now that we've kind of done a quick recap, looking at the clock, it's about 20 minutes after the hour, so I know that we only have about 35 or 40 minutes left. Yes. I can kind of hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right. On the previous slide where we talked about samples, is there an actual sample document, like a template to help with the regulations?
To my knowledge, there is no one single federal or Department of Defense document that tries to put all of this information into a set of training slides. They just don't have it yet.
Oh. Okay. Okay. That was the question. Thank you.
All right. So for the next 35 or 40 minutes, what we're going to focus on is walking through a couple of examples. Now, if we start to run out of time, because I realize we had some technical difficulties in the beginning, it's not really a problem. It just means that we'll get through the first example and maybe not fully through the second one. But either way, my contact information is in the slide deck, and each of you should have a PDF workbook that shows, I believe, 3 slides per page. So my contact information is in there as well. Feel free to reach out to me to ask questions, etc. My preferred communication is by email, because I spend a lot of time doing what we're doing right this second, training folks. I also spend a lot of time in meetings, a lot of time consulting with individual customers. If you do need to talk something over on a phone call, that's fine too, but let's just set up an appointment. So jumping back into the example, the very first control, number one out of alphabetical access control family, is to limit information system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users, or devices, including other information systems. And those devices, by the way, could be laptops, they could be servers, or they could be another information system such as Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Office 365. Now, as we look at that particular control, it's pretty generic. It's not a whole lot of detail in that sentence, that one single sentence. And so this is where we start looking at the additional resources that have been made available to us, such as the 171 Appendix F that just came out, the Handbook 162, the 171A, and if you really need to go look for additional information, then the 800-53. What should you end up with in your IT organization at the end of the day? A list of standards that relate back to these controls. So I don't really have a good way to measure response here, so I'm just kind of asking the question that you can pretty much just think to yourself in the back of your head. How many of you are familiar with all the things that we've just been talking about? So your familiarity, if it's not really good at this point, then we may want to try to fast track getting copies of these documents, and none of these documents or none of these tools, including the CSET tool, cost anything other than the time to download them off the appropriate website and begin to physically review them. And in the case of the CSET tool, to actually open it up and create an assessment. And when I say create an assessment, it's basically just create a brand new file and then start the process of going through the individual items. So the first thing that we're going to look at is, and this is all now in context of the control. I'm going to back up a page so that, actually I don't have to back up a page because the control itself is listed there with the blue background at the top. So the first control in the first family in Chapter 3 or Section 3 of NIST, the numbering system, allows you to pretty quickly go find those controls. So it's Section 3, where all 110 controls reside. And then this is the first family, alphabetically just happen to be accessed, and so that's the .1, the first .1. And the second .1 means that this is actually control number 1 in that particular family. So in the second family, you'll see like 3.2, the third family, 3.3, so on and so forth. And then for each family, you'll see 3.1, .2, .3. So you're not ever going to see a .110. What you'll see is in the first family, you'll see 1 through 22, and in the second family, however many controls that particular family has. So as a discussion, this is to provide context for access control for this particular requirement. We'll bring up a copy of the 171 here in just a second, but as you sit there, and I realize this could be an eye chart based on where you're sitting and viewing a screen, hopefully you can read this either in your copy of the PDF, the 171, or in the slide deck that was put out as a workbook. Notice that it talks about access control policies, it talks about devices and files, it talks about applications, and it talks about related requirements. In this case, at the very, very last sentence, it says addressed in requirement 3.1.2. So do keep in mind that a lot of these requirements overlap. So I'm going to flip over real quick to PDF and just kind of jump to that particular book. Give me just a second. I'm going to have to move a couple things over. So you should see it coming up, and that should be on your screen now. And just notice that as you jump down through the table of contents, Chapter 3 has all of the control families. And then in each of the sections, you'll see the detailed questions for those particular families. And then Appendix F at the very end is brand new, effective last month. Now, we'll also briefly look at some of the other documents to include the 171A and the Handbook 161. Excuse me, the Handbook 162. So again, interrupt me anytime if you've got questions that come up. Be more than happy to stop. I do need to kind of keep an eye on the clock. We've got about 30 minutes left. We'll likely only get through one of these examples, which is no problem, because what I'm trying to do here is to teach you the process, not just give you the multiple choice answers for the quiz. By teaching you the process, you should be able to go back to your organization and apply this in your particular environment. So what 162 does, as I mentioned earlier, it provides a series of auditable questions so that whenever vendors respond to these self-assessments, they can provide more consistency across the board, across all vendors and all contracts with how they're answering stuff. Now, the very first one, limit system access to authorized users. Notice that looks really familiar. That's what we were just looking at a second ago in both the 171 and in the 171A. Now, this is the Handbook 162. So for each of these auditable questions, you should be able to track whether it's yes, no, partially, or does not apply, or that you have an alternative approach. Now, we still don't have full synchronization amongst all these tools. So when we look at the CSAT in a moment, the series of answers may not be, restricted to like the words yes or no or partially. So very definitely, you'll need to place this type of information into some other document. I have a spreadsheet where I copied and placed everything into a spreadsheet. I believe Pam has a copy of one that was a spreadsheet that was done a few months ago. An updated version of that spreadsheet, which I can get to Pam on request, is inclusive of these types of questions. Does the company use passwords? Yes, no, partially, does not apply. Does the company have an authentication mechanism? So typically, a company might install or use Microsoft Active Directory. That would be considered an authentication mechanism. And then there's other questions that you can review where it will guide you through gaining enough context and have enough expertise that you can provide a relatively accurate and standardized response to the self-assessment that you're conducting. Now, this slide talks about the 171A. So the 171A also comes in PDF form. It can be downloaded directly off of the NIST website. If you do a Google search for NIST special publications in the 800 series, you'll see a number of pages of PDF documents, probably 100 or more. Simply scroll down to the two documents, one for the 171 and separately for the 171A, and then download for your personal use a version of that particular PDF. And then, like I mentioned a moment ago, things are changing. So I would suggest at least once a month, no more or no less often than once every couple of months, go back to that same website and double check whether or not there have been any other updates. It won't necessarily be very intuitive, but in the columns of information on that primary menu page, it'll tell you what date the publications were published. So right now, for both the 171 and also the 171A, the date that is listed is June 7, 2018. So you don't actually have to download anything to see if there's another one that has come out or been published. Simply go to the menu page for the 800 series of publications from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and then just scroll down so you can double check and verify that the date has not changed. If the date has changed, then by all means, please download the most current version. Now, this is the bullet list where you can pretty much verbatim turn these into IT standards. by having a standard that says that authorized users are identified. Generally speaking, every single person that authenticates into your information system should have a user ID. And that user ID should be their particular identification. Now, it's not just humans that they want to identify, because there are many information systems that talk back and forth directly. And so they still have a user ID, but it's just not, doesn't happen to be a human. In this case, those processes that authorize or act on behalf of authorized users should have unique user IDs as well. The individual computers, servers, and other information systems that have access to CUI, those need to ensure, or you should ensure, that they in fact are authorized. So a quick analogy would be in your corporate environment, even if it's, you know, small, medium, or large, if you're set up with Active Directory, then every workstation, laptop, etc., that connects to your information system has likely been added to your information system's Active Directory specifically by your IT group. Now, if somebody brings a laptop from home or a personal device, unless that personal device has been authorized by your organization to access information within your information environment, then that personal device should not be allowed to connect and have access to those resources. There should always be an authorization process, whether you're talking about a human or a non-human user or a physical device such as a laptop, a workstation, or a server. So again, this particular training session is about process. And so the process steps, just to go over them real quickly, is we know what the control is. We know what the Handbook 162 yes/no type questions are to help, you know, clarify whether you're keeping up with stuff. We know that there's a new appendix at the end of the 171 called discussion to provide even more context. And we know that we have the 171A version here with a bulleted series of statements that can be translated directly into standards and requirements. And then directly following this bulleted list would be the process or the physical method that they anticipate you would use in order to conduct the self-assessment on this particular control. As I mentioned, there's 3 assessment methods. There's examine, interview, and test. So examine is pretty much what you're going to see accomplished by anybody who has to audit stuff, right? They will ask you to provide copies of your documentation so that they can examine it. That documentation will include things like your system security plan, your security assessment report, and documentation that reflects every single one of the 110 controls that provides what's referred to as evidentiary artifacts that demonstrate that you actually are doing what your documents say you're supposed to be doing. So for instance, if there's a control that says that you keep track of something, then there should be a log somewhere that demonstrates that you're actually keeping track of it. That log could be electronic. That log could be on a Big Chief tablet with written down with a number 2 pencil, or that log could be in an email or anywhere else that you want to maintain it. One of the ways that they've provided for you to provide documentation is the CSET, the CyberSecurity Evaluation Tool. Now, as we look at that in a moment, we'll see that that particular tool allows you to apply attachments. So for instance, if you have a log of something that demonstrates you've been keeping track of stuff, then you would make a copy of that log, put it into, as an example, a PDF file, and then attach it to the CSET to demonstrate evidence that you're actually doing what you're saying that you're doing. Now, from an interview perspective, typically that would be where an auditor has a verbal interview with individuals and they'll be taking notes. So there's not a whole lot that you would be able to put down other than if you did have a discussion as an example with one of your IT security staff or one of your IT staff, and you asked them questions and they gave particular responses, then documenting that interview would definitely qualify as part of an assessment method. And then finally, test. And so test would be for things, as an example, there's a requirement for multi-factor authentication. That's going to actually be one of the biggest headaches that every organization has. And the simple way to test that, of course, is that if a person attempts to access an information system with controlled unclassified information, then they should not be successful unless they're using multi-factor authentication. So that'll be an example of a physical test that they can conduct and control. I'm going to speed it up here because I only see we've got about 22 minutes left. So this is Appendix D, where we have mapping of individual controls over the 80053. Again, this may have essentially become obsolete because the 171A has now been published and finalized. If you do have interest in 800-53, then here are the URLs to download the PDF files. But again, those two books total about 1,000 pages worth of reading. Now, the way the 800-53 is constructed is somewhat similar to what we saw a moment ago with 171A, where they have bullet lists, but they also have additional guidance and enhanced information. None of the additional guidance and enhanced information, even though they're listed in the mapping from the 171 over to the -53, are considered requirements. They're only considered additional context so that you can clarify and understand what the security control is talking about. Now the 53, this is an eye chart on purpose, don't even try to read it. It gets to be quite extensive. So as a recommendation, if you can get everything you need from the 800-171 or 171A or Handbook 162, then just stop right there and bring up the -53. The next slide is to simply demonstrate that if you were to analyze carefully enough, you can take a requirement from the 171 and begin to pick and choose those items in the 53 that are in fact relevant. Now, after all this has been done, after you've looked at the 162 and you've looked at the 171A and etc., coming up with a standard that reflects the true intent behind that rather vague requirement might be something like what you see on the screen there. Now, this is just a suggestion, just an example. Each organization is going to be different, but as a suggestion, you could have one standard be information system access is restricted to authorized users and devices. Just a simple restatement of the control itself. And then it talks about individual requirements such as limited authorized users, authorized devices, and authentication via a unique user ID and password. One of the tools that we've been talking about, the CSET tool, the CyberSecurity Evaluation Tool, allows you to take each of these individual questions specific to whichever framework you choose. So as long as you choose 800-171, then you're going to see the same exact control come up where it says limit information system access, et cetera, but notice that it's only got 4 answers that you can provide in this particular tool. Yes, no, not applicable, alternative response, which does not exactly match the 162, the Handbook 162, but it comes pretty close. Now, for each of these areas, you can go look at additional detail in the CSET tool. And the additional detail tool, as an example, under details, each of those items in the bullet list on the left becomes what appears to be a web page when you're physically using the tool. So if you click on details, you'll see title and category and security assurance level. If you were to click on these other options, supplemental, comments, documents, references, and discoveries, well, then that allows you to use that tool to store additional information. So if there's supplemental guidance, it's still pretty vague when you look at the CSET tool because it's using an older version of the 171. The comments are things that you can type in directly, so that if you have a comment to make about, as an example, when you expect to go address a particular control, then you could type that in directly at that point in time. Documents, if you click on that particular one, then that allows you the ability to attach other files to what has become a master assessment and self-evaluation file. So if you have a policy document or you have some type of memorandum, then by all means, just make a PDF out of that and then attach that to the CSET tool at the appropriate location for where that document would be relevant in the 110 controls. All right. So I did speed through that. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to go take another example and just run through it kind of quickly as well. Because again, what we're trying to accomplish right this second is not so much teach you what a control means. It's not so much teach you how to interpret stuff. It's to provide you a process and resources so that you at your organizations don't look at this one PDF file called the 171 and begin to pull your hair out and think, oh my gosh, I don't understand this stuff. So there are other resources, but getting all those resources at your fingertips and even understanding what those resources are and where they come from, that's what this is all about. I want to teach you the process. So let's take another example. Now, this example talks about the system security plans. So looking at the control number 3.12.4 from a process perspective, what have we learned? Well, we know that everything's in chapter 3, so that's what the 3 stands for. What's the .12 stand for? It just means that this is in the 12th family of the 14 overall controls in the 171. And then the last digit there, the .4 at a 3.12.4, what's the 4 mean? It's the 4th control in this particular family. And this one says, develop, document, and periodically update system security plans that describe system boundaries, system environments of operation, how security requirements are implemented, and the relationships or connections to other systems. So as you go through completion of your system security plan, even if all you're doing is using the CSET tool, in the comments section for each of the controls, you can put down what the system boundaries are. You can put down how your environment works and how it operates. If you've got graphing, or not graphing tools, but drawing tools such as Visio, then you can create overall displays just exactly like what I showed at the beginning, where we had a generic information environment. I think I may have heard somebody say something, so is there a question that I need to respond to? All right, so I don't see any questions and I don't see any chat items coming up. So we'll keep moving forward and we'll probably be able to run through this, not in detail, but just to reinforce the process. So 3.12.4 is talking about the system security plan. This is one of the deliverables that you must create as part of your compliance. When we look at the discussion section that's recently been added to the end of the primary document, this gives us some context. I know this is the eye chart, so I'm not asking anybody to read it. I'll just highlight a couple of words. Talks about plans that relate the security requirements to the set of controls, the set of security controls. So by going through the discussion section in the back of the PDF, you'll now begin to, in your mind, understand a bit more of the context of what NIST and NARA were looking for when they created these controls, or actually when they extracted these controls out of the federal version. Remember, the federal version is the 800-53. The total number of controls in the 800-53 is just under 300 controls, exactly 282, I believe. But of those 282, Many were considered very specifically unique to the federal world, and so only 110 were selected in order to be auditable by vendors or the vendor community or the supply chain. Now, what does the Handbook 162 provide related to your SSP? It gives you about 4 questions. Again, you can answer them with just yes, no, partially, doesn't apply. First question, does the system security plan explicitly define the authorization boundary for the system? So even when it asks questions like this, you may still have to go do some research. As an example, with this particular question, just what exactly do they mean by authorization boundary? Well, unless you're a security professional or been doing this for a number of years, you're likely going to have to do some research to find out what that definition is. In this case, the authorization boundary is when you have access for CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information, going in and out of your servers and in and out of your laptops and in and out of your email. As it goes to other locations, it's crossing boundaries. It's crossing boundary into an email system, or it's crossing boundary into another collection of servers. Those are the boundaries that they're discussing. And as you have controls related to your CUI, if you commingle your CUI with all the rest of your information, then your boundaries are those external things, such as when you send email to another person that's outside your organization. So everything inside your organization then becomes inside the authorization boundary, and all 110 controls have to be applied to everything inside your information authorization boundary. If you have the ability to reduce the scope by isolating the CUI, then by all means do that, because that can help reduce costs as well. But I absolutely understand that, especially in small to medium businesses, they commingle things simply because there's really no other way to conduct their business. And so if that's the case, then just be aware that your controls apply to your entire information environment. Additional questions, in this case, there's like 3 pages, at least 3 PowerPoint slides of questions, all related to the System Security Plan 3.12.4. Questions including like, does the System Security Plan describe the security requirements in place? Does it describe the requirements not yet in place? So if you plan something to put into place, logically, where would that go? Well, how about your POAM? Because quite specifically, remember the POAM acronym is the Plan of Actions and Milestones. So part of the System Security Plan requires that you create a document that talks about all your planned controls. And then again, the typical tool used is a POAM, either in a Word document or a spreadsheet or in a CSET type environment or some other type of tool or a combination of tools that works best for you. As we continue on, we've got a 3rd slide from the Handbook 162. Remember now, we're still talking about just this one single control, 3.12.4. Now, not every control has a dozen questions that go with it. Some controls only have 2 or 3, some have a half a dozen. But just keep in mind that as you start down this road, you're not trying to answer only 110 questions. You may actually find yourself answering a dozen times that in order to understand enough context about which the control is discussing, how this applies to your particular organization. Now, once you've got this context, you keep moving forward. You look at the appropriate spot in the 171A. Again, the 171A essentially being the bulleted list of requirements or the sub-requirements for each of the 110. This bulleted list works very, very handily to become a set of standards, smart standards, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. And then with these bulleted items come the suggested methods, not required, but the suggested methods for how you're going to demonstrate Yes or no, are you compliant with this particular control? You can examine documents. You can interview folks and then keep records of the interview. Or you can have records of an actual test. So as an example, a test, if we tried to log into something with an incorrect password or authentication tool, then there might be something on the screen that says access denied. Take a quick snapshot of that with your cell phone and then put that snapshot into a PDF file, and that becomes a record of how the test actually concluded. And again, if you've got insomnia, then by all means, go look at the multiple detailed references in over 1,000 pages worth of references in the 800-53. And then you can look for keywords that are relevant and begin to get an even clearer and better understanding of everything that you're looking at, resulting finally in those standards that we were talking about. Standards that an IT organization would implement and then also hold everyone in the organization, whether it be a private company, whether it be a nonprofit. If they've got CUI, then they need to have the rules by which they behave. And that's what the standards then provide. So, very quick recap. What are the 3 items necessary to demonstrate compliance? Your SSP, your SAR, and your POAM. The System Security Plan provides the overall set of documents that then demonstrate how you deal with information security requirements. Many of those documents can become attachments to the CSET file so that you can provide one solution to your vendor, whoever's asking about this in the first place, or you can not use the CSET at all and simply give them a collection of documents. There is no mandate for how the documentation is compiled. And then, of course, you must have assessed yourself, and you must have documented what you plan to do about those things where your assessment demonstrated that you have not yet achieved full compliance with that particular control on each of the 110. So if you've got 28 controls that you have not yet achieved full compliance, and those 28 controls would be in a POAM. The ones that have already met everything, well, they can be documented just with a spreadsheet or with the CSET tool directly. And at this point, I'm looking at the clock. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask again, see if we've got any questions. Hopefully that didn't go too fast. If anything comes to mind after we've shut the webinar off, that's not a problem either. There's my contact information, dave.gray@cyberdefenses.com. I'm also more than happy to network with folks that work with information security as well. So there's my LinkedIn address, linkedin.com/David Lee Gray, all one word. And then if you really want to know about the laundry list of the kind of certifications I have to keep up with, you can see those there as well. And then finally, the organization I work with is CyberDefenses. You reach CyberDefenses at either info@cyberdefenses.com or their phone number, 512-255-3700. We are located in Round Rock, Texas, just north of Austin, Texas. And we are more than happy to work with anybody and everybody on information security. So with that, are there any final comments, questions, or observations? And if not, then I want to pause here for a moment and make sure that everybody knows that me personally and CyberDefenses in general, we always appreciate the opportunity to talk with any organization. And the GCA has interested folks, and so we appreciate it.
And then, can you hear me?
Yes.
There is a question. Hold on a second.
Sure.
You did a great job. Thank you for all the information. I'm a Texas girl, so I know exactly where Round Rock is. So we'll move to that. My question is, when you come in to make sure that the company is compliant, is that something that takes a day? Is it something you figure and you assess prior to getting there? How does it work?
I apologize, but I'm not able to understand the audio. It's bouncing around and echoing. Can somebody recap that question or maybe type it into the chat box?
Can you hear me now, Dave?
I can hear you now.
Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay, great. First of all, I said thank you. I'm a Texas girl, so I know exactly where Round Rock is. So congratulations for being in my home state. The thing is, when you do an environment to make sure that we are compliant, what does that look like? Is that an all-day process? Is there some things we do prior to you coming? Or is it, I know it's expensive, but how does that actually work for a small company?
So what a small company would do is take the process I just mentioned, and they would step through each of those 110 items, looking at all the different contextual resources that are provided. Many of those conversations would need to occur with different people within the organization, so it would require probably not 110 meetings, but it would definitely require interaction. And then the most important thing, since the only confirmation that the US government can get in the near term, and I'm talking about like in the next couple of years, will be how you document what you do. And so it's going to be one of the most important portions of this compliance is to document everything. If you've heard the phrase, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And that's exactly the way the contracting officers will look at it. So this is not a small thing. Many of the controls are relatively easy, like the awareness and training. If you attend the 2-day class that I have, which goes into more detail about different controls, you'll see all the different types of ways to address each of these individual controls. I also have about a phone book size, at least 250 pages worth of templates that if you have folks that may not understand the information security roles or know what the documents should look like, then by all means go to CyberDefenses.com and look at the regulatory pages, and the sampled templates that I have are available from the company. The class is like $500 for 2 days, is all online. Separately, the templates are $1,000, and I think there's a slight discount if you get both together. But the simplest way for a small business, if they can afford it, would be to get assistance like that. If not from CyberDefenses, then from somebody. Because the last thing that you have time to go do is to divert yourself from your area of expertise and suddenly become a security expert.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dave. I think that's all of our questions here. So thank you so much for your presentation and also for the articles that you sent. If you have any other articles that you would like for me to share with the group, definitely forward that to me. But like I said, I emailed out the presentation. If you didn't receive it, let me know, and I can get that to you, the presentation and also the attachment PDF. So thanks again. David, if you want to hold, you can, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce our sponsor for today. After that, Mr. Andy Glenn, who graciously provided us with records this morning and some free information about life insurance. So, take it away. Thank you.
And now most of you are familiar with our name release, so they tell us about 90% of you are brand to it. But sadly, one of our tools, you know what we do. What we do is try what I call financial safety for America. We insure over 50 million people here in this country and that across the world. And the main thing is, what do you do when you have a situation when you lose income, or when you have a catastrophic situation, or you have a death in the family? That's why our goal is to be a financial safety. Our goal is the answer. The answer when someone needs that financial backing and that help. We do about providing brought you inside the business that'll help you attract people who know that to do what, like attract new people. But also, it helps you do what? Retain people. So, partnership with Aflac can help you attract and retain employees. And most importantly, we're able to do that at no additional cost for the business. You may be up or something like that, so let me clean that up. It's clear there. Because our benefits are filed as supplemental insurance and not as traditional based medical insurance, we don't fall under risk. So understand all these benefits actually, if you partner with business with Aflac, we provide a discount to their employees on both. Because they can go directly to us. Go to Aflac.com. We get signed up for their own action plan. If you're we'll pay about 40%. So your partnership with the business owner with Aflac does a couple things for your employees. Number one, let's be frank, most people on their own are not going to go out and shop disability, life insurance, cancer. They're not going to look at those companies on their own. But if you're an employer providing those benefits, they'll definitely take advantage of it. Okay? So number one, the first thing is the business owner, you're providing great benefits and great service by holding Aflac. Second thing is understand how I address this, the cost issue. Again, they can go direct to Aflac, but it's going to cost them 40% more. So the second thing you're doing is providing a deep discount. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is what I call deep administration. We need to understand some of the sales professionals and they're offering for something. And this is out in our head, and we're all agreeing it's great. And until
should go on.